So next we go to Transform Distort for perspective consistency. And part one is doing the distortion to get new images in the same perspective as the environment you're putting that image in. So first thing you're going to do is scroll down and zoom in to that artboard. And this will be a little bit of review from our first few exercises. So we're going to go to the artboard tool, extend that artboard out so that our vanishing points from our 2-point perspective can be seen. And that way we can map more vanishing points, or vanishing lines rather, that converge at that vanishing point we find with these current buildings. So taking the line tool, and we want that line tool in pixels mode so you don't have a million smart object layers. And I think that was something else I forgot to add in the instructions, so I'm really sorry about the inconvenience with that as well. And I'm not quite as perfect on finding these lines and their associated vanishing points as I am in the instruction manual. But luckily I already did it, so I can look approximately where the vanishing point should be based on what I have in the instruction manual, since this current mapping is quite a bit imperfect. And some of these intersections are a little bit more toward the center than what I have in the instruction manual, so I'm going to take a brush tool and mark where the vanishing point should be, here and here. There we go. And then I'm going to add a new layer. Then that will be my horizon line, a slightly slanted or Dutch angle horizon line. And I'm going to change that to purple, just so I can see it better. There we go. I basically connected the vanishing point dots to find that horizon line. Since the buildings are not slanted and the edges of the horizontal edges of the building are parallel to the ground plane instead of slanted, so they will be on that horizon line. So now I opened my Distort structure layer, and I'm taking the polygon lasso tool to easily select the straight edges of this image, the building and the floor. And I accidentally have the wrong layer selected, so when you do copy and paste the selection, you want to make sure you are on the correct layer. So I'm going to be a little bit lost for a second here as I figure this out. Okay, so now I have my distort structure selected. I copied and pasted it. It's on its own layer automatically. And now I can move that selection, copy and pasted selection around, transform it, maybe hold shift so you can change the proportions of it. And right now I have my distort structure image that I had selected from hidden, and I only have my copy and pasted selection showing, as well as the background layer with the original buildings that we had mapped out. And now with my vanishing point selected and established, not selected, just established, I can start to add more vanishing lines. And these can help guide further where my structure should be angled. And I'm just going to get rid of that messy set of lines that I used to try to find my vanishing points in the first place. Then I'm going to select my copy and pasted distort structure which is called layer 7 in my case, and I went to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. And I'm selecting that front plane of the building because that's the part that needs to be distorted into perspective. So transform, distort. And keep in mind I still have layer 7, which is my copy and pasted building structure. And now I'm just going to distort until these horizontal edges are lined up with my vanishing lines. So that can be from one window to the next. It can be the top of the awning. It can be the doors if they're aligned. These doors look like they're different sizes. And the bottom of that building. And now I'm just going to, with that layer still selected, erase out some of that ground so I can reveal the debris and brush of the layer under it. And I also went ahead and got rid of my new vanishing point lines first of all, and then with that building layer selected, I skewed it so that it could look a little more vertical. And I'm just eyeballing it. Okay, next for the integration edit. So we have our building perspective. Now we need to change the colors, values, etc. to integrate it in the environment better. And this is where I experiment. So I went to curves and changed the curves. And I am going to clip this adjustment layer to specifically the building, I believe. But it actually looks pretty good without having it clipped. In fact, maybe that was a mistake. And add some levels to that side plane. It looks a little bit too bright for the environment it's in. If you compare this plane to the plane to the left of it that's facing the same way, it does not seem to be getting as much sun on the left side. So I'm going to lower the contrast of this side plane so it looks like it's getting less sun as well. And I don't need to clip that since it's already masked to where I want it. And this gradient slider indicates how high key or low key the selection is. So by dragging the white arrow to the left, I made the selection lower key and darker. Lower key also means lower value range, so you're going to have more darks and dark midtones. Now for the clone stamp, which is kind of a weird one. First of all, it's harder to use with all these adjustment layers. And I think right now I have it on sample all layers. So it's confusing the way it really looks. So what I'm going to do later, I said layer too many times, is change the clone stamp setting to sample this layer only. And that way it won't be influenced by all the other layers, like the adjustment layers. But for now, I also have the adjustment layers hidden, so that doesn't confuse me as much. That's another option. Just hide the adjustment layers so that you can see what's going on. Probably the best bet is to just make a copy merged layer. This is just one of those things where you're sampling and then adding the sample. And when you sample a layer that is influenced by a bunch of other layers on top of it, you're not going to get an accurate sample. So it's better to just make a copy merged layer so everything you see is opaque and then everything you select is correct. But so for now, I just have my curves deselected. My levels layer only affects the side plane, so it doesn't matter. And I'm holding Alt or Option and clicking a sample and then applying that sample. And I had to do that over and over again. Okay, so you see I have sample current layer on the top right there next to Patsy, the ever mysterious Patsy. And now you see also I have my adjustment layers, my curves visible because it doesn't matter as much anymore when I'm only sampling the current layer, which is my building layer without any influence of the adjustments. So overall, if you're going to sample all layers, you want to have copy merged or just make your adjustment layers invisible, or you can just sample the current layer and then you won't get any complications from the influence of other layers like adjustment layers. Okay, that was confusing. Now back to just adding adjustment layers. So I'm upping the brightness here and I'm going to clip that to the building layer again. So Alt Option, click, and then I, for some reason, clip the levels to the building layer. It doesn't really make any difference since it already has a mask, as I just mentioned. And now add a, which one is it? Color balance layer. Ta-da! And when you do this, you want to make sure you're on the right value range, so that shadows, midtones, or highlights. And I realized it's not supposed to be on midtones, it's supposed to be on highlights. So slightly more cyan, slightly more yellow, and quite a bit more magenta as well. And that will help integrate the building to the rest of the building. So next is to add a shadow, which is called an ambient occlusion shadow. It's actually more technically just generally an ambient shadow. When we talk about form module, you'll find that occlusion means that you'll have an object in contact with another object, making that tiny little sliver of a dark shadow. And I'll explain why it's called ambient occlusion instead of just occlusion. But technically, this is just an ambient shadow because it's an ambient environment, but the buildings aren't tight and close enough together to technically be an occlusion shadow. So just something to note. And I'm changing the opacity of the shadow brush to 20% using a black color. And I'm using a soft brush, but I say in the instructions use a hard brush. I'll show you why in a minute. And because I have a low opacity brush, you want to limit how many strokes you use because otherwise you're going to have really messy paint strokes. So on my ambient occlusion layer, I added some dark paint strokes. And then I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. So this is where having a hard brush, this makes more sense. But I use a soft brush, so this Gaussian blur is going to be very, very subtle. Okay, and you can also Alt-Option drag this ambient occlusion layer to make it darker if you want. I think it looks too dark. It almost looks like the building in front is 3D. I guess that's kind of a cool effect, but not really what we're going for in this assignment. Now I'm going to add one final adjustment layer, which may or may not be even necessary. And what happens is you can select a color you want the selection layer, or sorry, adjustment layer to target, and then you can toggle how cyan, magenta, yellow, or black, so CMYK affected those color zones are. So my white color zone is going to be a bit more yellow. Okay, so that's done. And so now I can crop it with the artboard tool. And it's complete. Awesome. False alarm, I adjusted my curves layer. And I think that makes a big difference. So you can see how you can really get drastic, almost overcast effects with the curves tool.